The forest seemed alive in a way that townspeople never dared to speak of, its shadows stretching long and deep across the Appalachian hills. Few ventured there, and those who did returned with stories half-told, eyes wide with unnameable fear. At the heart of this wilderness stood a cabin, dark and unassuming, yet the air around it carried whispers like the rustling of dead leaves. Inside, a young girl moved silently through the dimly lit rooms, her eyes hollow yet knowing, carrying a secret that made even the bravest hearts falter. She was pregnant, though no one in the nearby town or anywhere knew how it had happened, or who was responsible. The family, tight-lipped and unnervingly still, offered no explanation, their faces carved in shadows, their intentions unreadable. Rumors began to snake through the neighboring hills, stories of ancestors who had never left these woods, of strange rituals, of lives entwined in ways that made the world outside shudder. An outsider, a local lawman drawn by unease, found himself walking paths he should have never crossed, senses tingling as if the forest itself was warning him away. Each step brought the air closer, heavier, charged with the weight of generations' secrets, and every glance at the girl reminded him that innocence and horror could exist side by side. Somewhere in the silence, a truth waited, horrifying and unspoken, and the question that haunted him most was simple yet impossible. Who had brought this child into the world, and why had the forest kept it hidden so long? Deep in the rugged, mist-laden hills of Appalachia, far beyond the reach of any bustling town or well-worn road, there existed a family whose very existence was more rumor than reality. Their home was tucked away in a part of the woods so dense and forbidding that few dared to enter, and those who did often turned back before even glimpsing the cabin, intimidated by the thick, tangled undergrowth and the eerie silence that hung over the forest like a shroud. Local townspeople spoke of them in hushed tones, sharing fragmented tales at the edges of gatherings, never daring to look too closely, as if the act of acknowledging them fully might summon some unspoken danger. The family had always been there, as far back as anyone could remember, their presence a dark undercurrent to the ordinary rhythm of life in the valleys and hollows. Their isolation was not just physical but social, they interacted with no one, their children were rarely seen beyond the edge of the tree line, and strangers who wandered too close were met with guarded stares and an unyielding, almost hostile silence. Over the years, the forest seemed to become a part of them, its shadows mingling with their movements, its twisted paths a labyrinth that outsiders could never hope to navigate. Hunters and hikers occasionally reported seeing faint lights flicker behind the thick canopy at night or hearing the faint, irregular sounds of activity that seemed human but never quite fit any pattern they recognized, as if the very essence of the family's life had merged with the rhythm of the wilderness. Stories grew with each retelling, each fragment exaggerated, until the family became less a group of people and more a specter haunting the memory of the valley, a symbol of what could fester unseen when left entirely to itself. Children whispered about them while daring one another to peer through the trees, daring each other to glimpse the darkened windows where figures might move like shadows, silent and unbroken in their vigilance. For outsiders, the cabin was at once impossibly distant and impossibly near, a place that could be sensed more than seen, felt more than approached. The landscape itself seemed to conspire to keep the family hidden, with sudden drops, thickets of thorny underbrush, and an almost deliberate twisting of the paths that led to their door, as if nature itself understood the need for concealment. No one really knew why the family remained so thoroughly secluded, whether it was fear, pride, or something darker entirely, but their isolation allowed them to live by their own rules, hidden away from the world, existing in a quiet, terrifying bubble of secrecy, and in doing so, they became a living enigma, a shadowed force in the heart of the mountains. In the heart of that isolated forest, there was a young girl whose presence seemed to blur the line between reality and rumor. She was quiet in a way that unsettled anyone who caught even the briefest glimpse of her, moving with a cautious grace through the cabin and the surrounding woods, as if she were aware of eyes watching that no one else could see. Her features were delicate but carried an intensity that made it impossible to look away, a gaze simultaneously curious, wary, and heavy with knowledge beyond her years. Those who encountered her, even at a distance, reported a strange stillness, the sense that she was absorbing every sound, every movement, and every shadow, cataloguing them with a precision that was almost unnatural. Her demeanor was not that of a child who had grown up in a normal household, it was shaped by the forest, the silence, and the unyielding rules of her family. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were clipped and deliberate, often leaving the listener more confused than enlightened. Neighbors who had lived near the outskirts of the woods for decades described glimpses of her at dawn, moving among the mist and the fog like a phantom, always alone, always watchful. There was a sense that she carried the weight of something unspeakable, a secret that was as old as the trees surrounding her and as heavy as the darkness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She was not just hidden from the outside world physically, but emotionally and socially, cut off from any semblance of ordinary childhood interactions, forced to navigate a life entirely governed by the inscrutable rules of her family. Despite her youth, there was an unsettling awareness in her eyes, an intelligence honed by isolation and observation, and a caution that hinted at an intimate knowledge of danger. Animals in the forest seemed to avoid her path, or perhaps she moved with such care that she left no trace, a ghost gliding through the underbrush without disturbing it. Even those who thought they knew her understood only fragments of her existence. Her days were a pattern of quiet survival, punctuated by moments of sharp, almost startling clarity when she would fix her gaze on something distant, as if seeing through the trees and into a world no one else could perceive. Her life was a web of shadows and secrets, and every movement she made carried with it a hint of stories untold, of tragedies and horrors observed but never shared. In her, the forest had found a perfect mirror, a silent witness to its own mysteries, and in her solitude, the girl embodied the strange, unsettling pulse of the woods, a presence both fragile and terrifying, entirely unlike anything the outside world could imagine or comprehend. The revelation of her pregnancy struck the surrounding community like a cold, sudden wind, cutting through the already thick atmosphere of suspicion and fear that clung to the secluded forest. No one had anticipated it, and the shock was compounded by the fact that no one, not a single soul beyond the family, knew who could possibly be responsible. Whispers began immediately, small at first, tentative murmurs exchanged in the back corners of local shops and over fences where neighbors glimpsed each other cautiously, sharing what little they knew. The girl herself said nothing, her silence as heavy and impenetrable as the walls of the cabin she inhabited, leaving those who noticed her condition to fill the void with speculation, fear, and sometimes outright horror. The situation challenged the very limits of understanding for the small townspeople who had always preferred to ignore the family entirely, leaving them to exist as a shadowed presence on the outskirts of the wilderness. Even the most hardened and curious locals could not imagine how such a thing could occur in complete secrecy, in a place so tightly controlled by a family known for their isolation and their silence. As the pregnancy became undeniable, rumors spread like wildfire, each person adding details they had no way of confirming, weaving an ever more disturbing tapestry of potential explanations. Some whispered of sins hidden over generations, of rituals that should not have been allowed to persist, while others feared more immediate and tangible horrors. The girl's condition, visible yet unexplained, became a lens through which the community's anxieties and darkest imaginings focused, transforming her from a quiet, ghost-like figure into a symbol of everything unsettling about the family's hidden life. People began to watch the forest more closely, scanning the tree line for glimpses of what might be lurking, wondering how a pregnancy could remain hidden for so long in a place thought by many to be almost impossible to reach. Even those who might have felt empathy for the girl found themselves frozen by the strangeness of it all, unable to reconcile the innocence of youth with the heavy, inexplicable reality growing inside her. Questions hung in the air with the weight of a storm. Who was responsible, how could such secrecy persist, and what would the family do now that this undeniable truth had emerged? The girl, meanwhile, continued to move through her days as though nothing had changed, carrying the weight of her condition in silence, each step a reminder that the forest could hide many things, but some secrets would eventually demand attention, drawing the gaze of those who would dare to look too closely into the hidden, shadowed corners of her life and the dark legacy of the family that protected her. The family's silence was absolute, a wall that pressed in on anyone who attempted to probe too deeply into the girl's condition. No one spoke of it openly within the cabin, and when outsiders dared to ask questions, the answers were evasive, minimal, and chilling in their brevity. Even the girl herself seemed to have absorbed this code of quiet, offering nothing but cryptic expressions or averted eyes whenever the topic arose. Her parents and older relatives moved through the house with a deliberate, watchful calm, their presence a constant reminder that every word, every gesture, was being measured and controlled. The townspeople, initially curious, quickly learned that prying yielded nothing but discomfort and unease, that the family's walls extended far beyond the wooden planks of the cabin into a psychological barrier that resisted intrusion. Attempts to communicate were met with cold stares, brief shakes of the head, or murmurs so faint they seemed almost rehearsed, as if the family had long since perfected the art of speaking without revealing anything of true significance. This silence was not merely a lack of information, it was a form of control, a means of shaping the narrative without ever uttering a word, leaving others to fill the void with fear, suspicion, and imagination. Even neighbors who had occasionally glimpsed the girl or her relatives through the trees could not discern the shape of their lives, the rhythms of their days, or the boundaries of the family's internal world. Inside the cabin, the girl's movements were precise and careful, her interactions limited, almost ritualistic, as though any deviation might invite consequences beyond understanding. Meals were eaten quietly, chores performed with a studied efficiency, and conversations were limited to what was necessary, leaving a constant, suffocating tension that hung in the air like smoke. Outsiders felt it immediately, an oppressive sense that something vital was being withheld, a truth too heavy for ordinary disclosure. The family's silence had a rhythm, a pulse that was almost tangible, and anyone who tried to break it found themselves met with subtle but unmistakable resistance. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the secrecy over generations, echoing back any attempt to pry with an intangible pressure that left the intruder feeling small, foolish, and intruded upon. In this environment, the girl existed within a bubble of unspoken rules, conditioned from a young age to accept that some realities were not meant to be shared, that some questions would remain unanswered, and that the world beyond the forest would only ever perceive fragments of what truly transpired. This meticulous, almost ritualized silence ensured that the mystery of her pregnancy, and the dark circumstances surrounding it, remained shrouded in impenetrable secrecy, a shadowed force that shaped every interaction, every glance, and every heartbeat within the cabin, leaving outsiders to wrestle with their own curiosity, fear, and imagination in the absence of any clear answers. The investigation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with small observations that drew the attention of a local law enforcement officer who had long been uneasy about the secluded family. At first, it was nothing more than a sense of suspicion, a feeling that the odd patterns of the family's life and the whispers of townspeople might conceal something far darker than anyone dared to imagine. The girl's pregnancy, discovered under circumstances no one could explain, acted as a catalyst, turning vague unease into a pressing need for answers. The officer started by retracing the faint paths that led into the forest, noting the way the underbrush seemed unnaturally dense and how certain trails appeared deliberately maintained, as if someone wanted them to remain hidden from prying eyes. Each step closer to the cabin increased the tension, the quiet of the woods punctuated only by the occasional snapping twig or the rustle of unseen creatures, a reminder that nature itself was intertwined with the family's secretive existence. Initial inquiries among neighbors yielded little, as most were too afraid to speak, and those who did offered fragmented stories or half-remembered tales of strange lights, odd sounds, or fleeting glimpses of figures moving behind trees. The officer began to piece together a timeline of the girl's movements, the family's routines, and the history of their isolation, noting patterns that suggested a life meticulously hidden from the outside world. It became clear that the family's seclusion was not merely a preference but a shield, designed to keep any intrusion at bay and maintain control over their environment. As the investigation deepened, the officer faced subtle resistance, not overt threats, but an intangible tension that made every approach feel perilous. The forest itself seemed to resist scrutiny, with winding trails, sudden drop-offs, and dense foliage creating a labyrinth that frustrated every attempt to get closer. Even when the officer finally caught sight of the girl or her relatives, their expressions offered nothing, their silence as impenetrable as the walls of their cabin. It became evident that uncovering the truth would require patience, careful observation, and an ability to read the smallest of signals, the slight hesitation in a glance, the faintest sound, or a footprint half hidden in the dirt. Each revelation hinted at layers of secrecy, each small fact confirmed that the family had lived entirely on their own terms, outside the gaze of law or society. The officer could sense the weight of generations pressing down, a history encoded in the very structure of the cabin and the paths leading to it, making clear that the investigation was not merely about one pregnancy but about a long, dark lineage of isolation, control, and hidden horrors. With every passing day, the forest seemed to grow heavier, the shadows longer, and the questions more urgent, as the investigation became a delicate dance between uncovering the truth and navigating the silent, watchful vigilance of a family determined to remain unseen, leaving the mystery of the girl's pregnancy dangling over the edge of discovery, tantalizing, terrifying, and unresolved. As the investigation deepened, fragments of the family's dark history began to emerge, revealing a lineage riddled with secrets that had festered for generations. Records were scarce, and oral accounts from the few willing to speak painted a picture of isolation so complete it bordered on the unnatural. Ancestors had lived entirely within the boundaries of the forest, rarely interacting with outsiders, and over decades, stories of strange behaviors, whispered rituals, and unexplained disappearances had accumulated, creating a cloud of suspicion and fear that hung over the family like a permanent shadow. The inbreeding that had occurred over multiple generations was not widely known, but hints appeared in the physical resemblance between family members, the eerie repetition of features, and the strange, almost ritualistic patterns in their daily lives. The girl's pregnancy, unexplained and shrouded in silence, suddenly took on a more ominous tone when viewed through the lens of this dark ancestry. It became impossible to separate her condition from the patterns of secrecy, control, and isolation that had defined her family for decades. Investigators began to understand that the family had not merely been secluded by choice, they had created an environment where behaviors and relationships that the outside world would never condone could persist unchecked. Every detail, from the layout of the cabin to the strict control over who left and who entered the property, was a reflection of a lineage that had learned to protect its secrets at any cost. Stories from neighboring towns, previously dismissed as gossip, began to make grim sense. Accounts of sudden disappearances, strange sounds in the night, and glimpses of figures moving unnaturally through the woods all pointed toward a family whose life was governed by its own rules. The history of inbreeding, while hidden, suggested an internal logic that outsiders could neither understand nor easily penetrate. It explained the girl's isolation, the family's silence, and the almost ritualized way in which they moved through their daily lives, as if every action were part of a centuries-old pattern designed to shield themselves from the outside world. Even the investigator, trained to seek facts and evidence, felt the weight of a past that had molded the present, a past so deeply ingrained that every question about the girl's pregnancy brought with it echoes of a long, dark lineage that refused to be acknowledged. The family's history was a lens through which the unexplained could be partially understood, yet it also made the mystery far more terrifying. The girl's condition, when examined alongside the patterns of her ancestors, was no longer an isolated anomaly but a continuation of a hidden, generational story, one that thrived in secrecy and darkness, bound to the forest, the family, and the inescapable weight of what had come before, leaving the world outside to speculate, fear, and wonder what horrors might still be concealed behind the thick, unyielding walls of the cabin and the even thicker shadows of the woods surrounding it. The investigators' discovery of hidden locations within the forest marked a turning point that deepened the sense of unease surrounding the girl and her family. At first, the paths seemed ordinary, overgrown trails that could easily be mistaken for natural breaks in the underbrush, but closer inspection revealed signs that they were maintained, used deliberately, and led to places meant to remain unseen. Concealed behind thick tangles of trees and thorny shrubs were small cabins, lean-tos, and hidden rooms whose existence no outsider could have guessed. Some were only partially visible, their roofs camouflaged with moss and branches, blending seamlessly into the surrounding forest, as if the woods themselves were complicit in keeping them secret. Others were cleverly built into natural depressions or behind rock outcroppings, requiring knowledge of the terrain to locate, knowledge only the family possessed. Each hidden structure revealed another layer of the family's carefully guarded life, spaces where daily routines were conducted away from prying eyes, and where the girl's existence could be shielded from anyone who might ask too many questions. Inside these places, the investigator noticed signs of long-term habitation, crude but functional furnishings, small stacks of provisions, and personal items that suggested a life lived entirely apart from the world outside. Some rooms bore marks of deliberate concealment, doors without handles, windows that faced only the forest's interior, and locks fashioned to keep anyone unfamiliar from entering. These spaces felt like repositories of secrets, each one a physical manifestation of the family's obsession with privacy and control, and each seemed to pulse with the unspoken histories of generations. The sense of being watched was constant, It was as if the forest itself had eyes, and every movement within it echoed back with a weight that made the investigator uneasy. Small discoveries, like hidden journals or sketches tucked away behind loose boards, hinted at lives shaped by strict rules, rituals, and perhaps behaviors no outsider could comprehend. Every hidden location uncovered reinforced the understanding that the family had created an entire parallel world, one where normal societal rules held no sway and where the girl's life, including her unexplained pregnancy, could be governed entirely by the family's will. The woods were more than just a barrier, they were a labyrinthine shield, concealing evidence, controlling perceptions, and reinforcing the family's isolation. As the investigator moved cautiously from one hidden space to another, the forest seemed to close in, the air thick with the weight of unseen presences, and the sense that the further one went, the deeper the mystery became, and the closer one came to truths that were terrifying in their implications, truths that suggested the girl's life, her body, and the events surrounding her pregnancy were all contained within a carefully orchestrated system of secrecy and concealment, protected by the very earth and trees that had witnessed generations of darkness. As the investigation progressed, the murmurs and fragmented stories from the surrounding community began to take on a chilling coherence, revealing layers of fear and suspicion that had long been suppressed. Neighbors, initially hesitant to speak, gradually shared recollections of strange occurrences, each account more unsettling than the last. Some remembered hearing distant screams or unusual noises echoing through the forest at odd hours, sounds that could not be easily explained and that seemed to vanish as soon as one tried to locate their source. Others spoke of fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures moving unnaturally among the trees, silhouettes that shifted and lurked in ways that suggested an intimate familiarity with the dense terrain. There were tales of children who had wandered too close to the forest's edge, only to retreat in terror, claiming to have seen people behaving strangely, their features blurred or distorted in the half-light of dusk and dawn. Stories of mysterious lights appearing in the woods at night circulated, strange flickers that suggested activity beyond ordinary survival or domestic life, hinting at rituals or gatherings that no outsider could penetrate. These rumors, passed quietly between neighbors and through hushed conversations in town, painted a picture of a family whose life had always been enshrouded in secrecy, whose presence was felt more than it was seen, and whose influence extended subtly into the consciousness of the surrounding area. Each anecdote, whether believed fully or dismissed as imagination, contributed to an ever-growing sense of unease, a web of suspicion that connected the girl's unexplained pregnancy to a broader tapestry of hidden behaviors and unspoken rules. The stories suggested that the family's history of inbreeding, isolation, and secrecy had not only shaped their private lives but had cast a shadow over the entire community, instilling fear and caution in those who lived nearby. Even decades-old accounts, passed down through generations, hinted at disappearances or incidents that had never been formally investigated, creating an impression that the forest itself harbored dark truths protected by those who called it home. The more the investigator listened, the more it became clear that the family operated according to a logic entirely their own, one that valued concealment, control, and the perpetuation of their secrets above all else. The girl's condition was thus not an isolated anomaly but part of a continuum, a modern manifestation of a legacy steeped in silence and manipulation. Every fragment of information, every rumor, and every fearful recollection reinforced the idea that the community's collective memory had long acknowledged the presence of something unsettling, yet no one had dared to confront it directly. The stories were pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, suggested a reality far darker than the casual observer could imagine, a shadowed existence at the heart of the woods that kept the girl's life, her pregnancy, and the family's secrets contained within an impenetrable veil of fear, suspicion, and unspoken knowledge. As the investigation pressed forward, a sense of creeping danger began to suffuse every step taken into the forest, making the woods feel alive with a silent, watchful presence. The outsider, initially drawn by curiosity and duty, quickly realized that moving closer to the family's hidden world carried risks far beyond what could be anticipated. Every path seemed to shift subtly, every rustle of leaves suggested observation, and every shadow cast by the towering trees appeared to conceal more than just the natural wilderness. It was as though the forest itself had conspired with the family to guard their secrets, and the investigators' movements were being monitored by unseen eyes. Subtle signs of surveillance emerged, footprints too carefully placed, broken twigs indicating someone had passed recently, and glimpses of figures disappearing between the trees, leaving no trace. The family's vigilance was evident in the way the girl and her relatives moved, seemingly aware of every intrusion, their actions precise, deliberate, and always just out of reach. Animals, too, seemed to sense the tension, either fleeing silently at the approach of the investigator or freezing in unnatural stillness as if sharing in the forest's silent warning. Attempts to document the girl's condition or her family's routines were fraught with difficulty, as the slightest sound or misstep could draw attention, prompting abrupt withdrawal from hidden spaces or fleeting appearances that only deepened the mystery. It became clear that the family had established a network of observation, using the terrain, natural cover, and their intimate knowledge of the woods to maintain constant vigilance. Even from a distance, the sense of being watched was nearly suffocating, pressing on the mind and amplifying the fear that something unseen might intervene at any moment. The investigator felt the forest grow heavier with each passing hour, the air thickening with tension and the potential for confrontation. Paths once thought clear now appeared treacherous, and areas previously assumed safe seemed to conceal traps, both physical and psychological. The combination of the family's acute awareness and the forest's natural defenses created an environment where progress was measured not by distance traveled, but by one's ability to anticipate, evade, and endure the subtle threats surrounding every movement. As the investigator advanced, it became impossible to separate the danger posed by the family from the inherent menace of the forest itself, a duality that reinforced the isolation and vulnerability of anyone who dared approach. The presence of the girl's unexplained pregnancy added an urgency to every observation, turning each step into a careful negotiation between discovery and self-preservation. It was evident that the deeper one ventured into the woods, the more the shadows lengthened, and the more the unseen forces, both human and natural, asserted themselves, creating a tension that was tangible, relentless, and inescapable, leaving the investigator acutely aware that curiosity in this place carried consequences that could never be fully anticipated or controlled. Even as fragments of the girl's story came into view, the most haunting truths remained just beyond reach, leaving questions suspended in the dense, oppressive air of the forest. The mystery of who had impregnated her was an enigma wrapped in layers of secrecy, protected not only by the family's rigid control but by the labyrinthine woods that seemed to shift and close around any outsider daring to intrude. Every lead the investigator uncovered only deepened the uncertainty, revealing glimpses of patterns and histories without ever providing clear answers. The girl herself carried an unspoken knowledge, her silence both a shield and a puzzle, leaving those who observed her to grapple with fragments of fear, pity, and incredulity. It became evident that the pregnancy was not an isolated incident but a symptom of a broader, generational web of isolation, secrecy, and manipulation, one that had been carefully preserved and reinforced for decades. Even as townspeople whispered about ancestors, strange rituals, and long-forgotten disappearances, no one could piece together the full picture, as if the forest itself conspired to obscure the truth. Attempts to approach the family, to question them directly or investigate the cabin, were met with a subtle but unmistakable resistance, a warning that the boundaries of intrusion had been clearly defined and that crossing them came with unknown risks. The weight of this resistance made it increasingly clear that the forest was more than a physical barrier, it was a psychological one, a living entity entwined with the family's will, shaping perception and controlling access. Each unanswered question about the girl's condition, the family's history, and the unseen forces at work contributed to a growing sense of dread, a realization that the truth might never fully be uncovered. The investigator was left with fragments, fleeting glimpses of hidden rooms, the faint echo of long-ago voices in the trees, and the girl's own inscrutable expressions that hinted at knowledge far beyond her years. In the spaces between these fragments, imagination and fear took root, filling the gaps with possibilities more terrifying than any certainty could provide. It became clear that the story would remain incomplete, a puzzle whose pieces were deliberately scattered and concealed, meant to test the limits of understanding and patience. The forest and the family together maintained an equilibrium in which some truths could be hinted at, some horrors glimpsed, but none fully revealed. And so the question lingered, heavy and unrelenting: who had brought this child into the world, and what had allowed such a secret to persist, hidden in the shadows of the Appalachian wilderness, preserved through generations of silence, concealment, and careful, deliberate control, leaving every observer suspended on the edge of comprehension, haunted by what they might never know and terrified of what they might accidentally uncover if they dared to look too closely.